You are listening to Audio SSLC, your audio medium for easy understanding and revision.
To download a copy of this recording, please visit audiosslc.com. Lesson 7: The Girl Who Was Annie Frank by Louis D. Jong. Pre-reading activity. Have you heard of Adolf Hitler? What comes uppermost to your mind when you think of him? Discuss in pairs. 1. And how do you know that the human race is worth saving? An argumentative young student once asked his professor. Said the professor, I have read Annie Frank's diary. 2. How this diary of a teenage girl came to be written and saved is a story as dramatic as the diary itself. No one foresaw the tremendous impact that the small book would have, not even her father, who had it published after Annie's death in a Nazi concentration camp. 3. The diary of Annie Frank has now been published in 19 languages, including German, and has sold nearly 2 million copies. Made into a play by Francis Goderich and Albert Hackett, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and in the 1956-1957 season alone, played in 20 different countries to 2 million people. In London, it ran for nearly 6 months at the Phoenix Theatre. 20th Century Fox turned it into a film. 4. To understand this amazing response, it is necessary first to understand the girl who was Annie Frank. 5. When Hitler came to power, Otto Frank was a banker living in Germany. He had married in 1925. In 1926, his first daughter Margot was born, and 3 years later, his second, Anneliese Mary. She was usually called Annie, sometimes Tender One. 6. In the autumn of 1933, when Hitler was issuing one anti-Jewish decree after another, Otto Frank decided to emigrate to the hospitable Netherlands. He started a small firm in Amsterdam. Shortly before the outbreak of war, he took in a partner, Mr. Van Daan, a fellow refugee. Mostly they traded in spices. Business was often slow. Once Otto Frank was forced to ask his small staff to accept a temporary cut in their modest wages. No one left. They all liked his warm personality. They admired his courage and the evident care he took to give his 2 girls a good education. 7. As a pupil, Annie was not particularly brilliant. Most people believed with her parents that Margot, her elder sister, was more promising. Annie was chiefly remarkable for the early interest she took in other people. She was emotional and strong-willed, a real problem child, her father once told me, a great talker and fond of nice clothes. Life in town, where she was usually surrounded by a chattering crowd of girlfriends, suited her exactly. This was a lucky fact, because the Frank family could only rarely afford a holiday, nor did they own a car. 8. When the Nazis invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, the Franks were trapped. Earlier than most Jews in Amsterdam, Otto Frank realized that the time might come when he and his family would have to go into hiding. He decided to hide in his own business office, which faced one of Amsterdam's tree-lined canals. A few derelict rooms on the upper floors, called the annex, were secretly prepared to house both the Frank and the Van Daan families. 9. Early in July 1942, Margot Frank was called up for deportation, but she did not go. Straight away, the Franks moved into their hiding place, and the Van Daans followed shortly afterwards. 4 months later, they took into their camped lodgings another Jew, a dentist. 10. Songbird in hiding. They were 800 people. Any sound, any light might betray their presence. A tenuous link with the outside was provided by the radio and by 4 courageous members of Otto Frank's staff, 2 of them typists, who in secret brought food, magazines, books. The only other company they had was a cat, Levin. While in hiding, Annie decided to continue a diary which her parents had given her on her 13th birthday. She described life in the annex with all its inevitable tensions and quarrels. But she created first and foremost a wonderfully delicate record of adolescence, sketching with complete honesty a young girl's thoughts and feelings, her longing and loneliness. I feel like a songbird whose wings have been brutally torn out and who is flying in utter darkness against the bars of its own cage, she wrote when she had been isolated from the outside world for nearly 16 months. 2 months later, she had filled every page of the diary, a small book bound in a tartan cloth, and one of the typists, Miep, gave her an ordinary exercise book. Later, she used Margot's chemistry exercise book. 12. Her diary reveals the trust she puts in a wise father, her grief because, as she feels it, her mother does not understand her, the ecstasy of a first rapturous kiss exchanged with the Van Daan's 17-year-old son, finally the flowering personality eager to face life with adult courage and mature self-insight. 13. On a slip of paper, Annie wrote faked names which she intended to use in case of publication. For the time being, the diary was her own secret which she wanted to keep from everyone, especially from the grumpy dentist with whom she had to share her tiny bedroom. Her father allowed her to put her diaries in his briefcase. 14. He never read them until after her death. 15. Courageous leader. On August 4, 1944, 1 German and 4 Dutch Nazi policemen suddenly stormed upstairs. How the secret of the annex had been revealed is not known. "Where are your money and jewels?" they shouted. Mrs. Frank and Mrs. Van Daan had some gold and jewelry. It was quickly discovered. Looking round for something to carry it in, one of the policemen noticed Otto Frank's briefcase. He emptied it onto the floor, barely giving a glance at the notebooks. Then the people of Annex were arrested. 16. In the beginning of September, while the Allied armies were rapidly approaching the Netherlands, the Franks and Van Daans and the dentist were carried in cattle trucks to Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp in southern Poland. There, the Nazis separated Otto Frank from his wife and daughters without giving them time to say farewell. Mrs. Frank, Annie, and Margot were marched into the women's part of the camp, where Mrs. Frank died from exhaustion. The Van Daans and the dentist too lost their lives. 17. Annie proved to be a courageous leader of her small Auschwitz group. When there was nothing to eat, she dared to go to the kitchen to ask for food. She constantly told Margot never to give in. Once she passed hundreds of Hungarian Jewish children who were standing naked in freezing rain, waiting to be led to the gas chambers, unable to grasp the horrors inflicted upon them in the world of adults. "Oh, look, their eyes," she whispered. 18. Later in the autumn, she and her sister were transported to another camp, Belsen, between Berlin and Hamburg. A close friend saw her there, cold and hungry, her head shaved, and her skeleton-like form draped in the coarse, shapeless, striped garb of the concentration camp. She was pitifully weak, her body racked by typhoid fever. She died early in March 1945, a few days after Margot. Both were buried in a mass grave. 19. In Auschwitz, Otto Frank had managed somehow to stay alive. He was freed early in 1945 by the Russians, and in the summer he arrived back in liberated Amsterdam. A friend had told him that his wife had died, but he kept on hoping that Annie and Margot would return. After 6 weeks of waiting, he met someone who had to tell him that both had perished. It was only then that Miep, his former typist, handed him Annie's diaries. 20. Mission in life. A week after the Frank family had been arrested, Miep had boldly returned to the annex. A heap of paper lay on the floor. Miep recognized Annie's handwriting and decided to keep the diary but not to read it. Had she read it, she would have found detailed information on the help she and other people had given the Frank family at the risk of their own lives, and she might well have decided to destroy the diary for reasons of safety. 21. It took Otto Frank many weeks to finish reading what his dead child had written. He broke down after every few pages. As his old mother was still alive, she had emigrated to Switzerland, where other near relatives lived. He started copying the manuscript for her. Some passages which he felt to be too intimate or which might hurt other people's feelings were left out by him. The idea of publishing the diary did not enter his mind. He gave one typed copy to a close friend, who lent it to a professor of modern history. Much to Otto Frank's surprise, the professor devoted an article to it in a Dutch newspaper. His friends now urged Otto Frank to have Annie's diary published as she herself had wished. In one passage she had written, "I want to publish a book entitled The Annex After the War. My diary can serve this purpose." When Annie's father finally consented to publication, the manuscript was refused by two well-known Dutch publishers. A third decided to accept it, and he sold more than 150,000 copies of the Dutch edition. 22. Other editions followed. 250,000 sold in Britain, a like number in Japan, 435,000 in the United States. Otto Frank began to receive hundreds of letters. One from Italy was addressed, "Otto Frank, father of Annie Frank, Amsterdam."
You are listening to Audio SSLC, your audio medium for easy understanding and revision.
To download a copy of this recording, please visit audiosslc.com. A few people doubted the authenticity of the diary. Most wrote to express their admiration and grief. Girls of Annie's age poured out their troubles. "Oh, Mr. Frank," wrote one girl, "she is so much like me that sometimes I do not know where myself begins and Annie Frank ends." Numerous people sent small presents. Some exquisite dolls were made for him by Japanese girls. A Dutch sculptress presented him with a statue of Annie. On the birthdays of Annie and Margot, flowers arrived anonymously. 23. So many letters poured in that Otto Frank was forced to retire from business. The care of his daughter's diary had become his passion, his mission in life. All royalties were devoted to humanitarian causes, which he felt would have been approved by Annie. All letters were answered by him personally. Every day new ones sadly reminded him of the losses he had suffered. But he felt that there was truth and consolation in what the headmistress of one of England's largest schools wrote to him. "It must be a source of deep joy to you, in all your sorrow, to know that Annie's brief life is, in the deepest sense, only just beginning." 24. The most remarkable response came from Germany. When the book's first printing of 4,500 copies came out in Germany in 1950, many booksellers were afraid to put it in their windows. 25. Mass appeal. When the play opened in 7 German cities simultaneously, no one knew how the audiences would react. The drama progressed through its 8 brief scenes. No Nazis were seen on the stage, but their ominous presence made itself felt every minute. Finally, at the end, Nazi jackboots were heard storming upstairs to raid the hiding place. At the close of the epilogue, only Annie's father was on the stage, a lonely old man. Quietly, he told how he received news that his wife and daughters had died. Picking up Annie's slim diary, he turned back the pages to find a certain passage, and as he found it, her young, confident voice was heard saying, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." 26. Packed audiences received Anne Frank's tragedy in a silence heavy with remorse. In Dusseldorf, people did not even go out during the interval. They sat in their seats as if afraid of the lights outside, ashamed to face each other, someone reported. The Dusseldorf producer, Kuno Eppel, explained, Anne Frank has succeeded because it enables the audience to come to grips with history, personally and without denunciation. We watch it as an indictment in the most humble, pitiful terms of inhumanity to fellow men. No one accuses us as Germans. We accuse ourselves. 27. For years, Germany's post-war administrators toiled to make people feel the senseless and criminal nature of the Nazi regime. On the whole, they failed. The diary of Anne Frank succeeded. Leading actors received dozens of letters. I was a good Nazi, a typical letter read, but I never knew what it meant until the other night. German schoolchildren sent Otto Frank letters signed by entire classes, telling him that Annie's diary had opened their eyes to the viciousness of racial persecution. In West Berlin, an Anne Frank home was opened, devoted to social work for young people. The people of Berlin had chosen her name to symbolize the spirit of racial and social tolerance. Elsewhere in Germany, an organization was set up, named after her, to combat remaining vestiges of anti-Semitism. In Vienna, money was collected for Anne Frank forest to be planted in Israel. 28. In March 1957, a Hamburg student suggested that flowers should be laid on the mass graves on Bergen-Belsen, where Anne Frank had found her last resting place. More than 2,000 young people eagerly answered his appeal. Hundreds pedaled on bikes 120 kilometers in lashing rain. Standing in front of one of the mass graves, a 17-year-old schoolgirl expressed what all felt. Anne Frank was younger than we are when her life was so horribly ended. She had to die because others had decided to destroy her race. Never again among our people must such a diseased and inhuman hatred arise. 29. Anne's brief life is indeed only beginning. She carries the message of courage and tolerance all over the world. She lives after death. Glossary. Nazi. The political party led by Adolf Hitler, which controlled Germany from 1933 to 1945. Concentration camp. A prison consisting of a set of buildings inside a fence, where political prisoners were kept in very bad conditions. Decree. An order having the force of a law. Emigrate. To leave the country permanently and go to live in another. Derelict. In bad condition. Annex. A wing added to a building. Deportation. Forcing to leave the country. Cramped. Not having enough space, or narrow. Tenuous. So light that it hardly exists. Inevitable. Certain to happen. Adolescence. Period of time in a person's life when he or she is developing into an adult. Tartan. Woolen cloth with a woven pattern of straight lines of different colors crossing at right angles. Ecstasy. State of extreme happiness. Rapturous. Expressing great delight. Grumpy. Bad-tempered. Racked. Verb. Caused to suffer. Authenticity. Genuineness or truthfulness. Exquisite. Delicate. Anonymously. Unidentified. Ominous. Threatening. Jackboot. A long boot which covers the leg up to the knee. Epilogue. Concluding speech. Remorse. Shame. denunciation, condemnation. Indictment, accusation. Viciousness, cruelty and violence. Persecution, treating somebody in a cruel way. Vestiges, traces. Anti-Semitism, hatred or cruel treatment of Jewish people. Extended reading. Say This City Has 10 Million Souls by W.H. Auden. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear, yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear, we cannot go there now. In the village churchyard there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can do that, my dear, old passports can do that. The consul banged the table and said, If you've got no passport, you're officially dead. But we are still alive, my dear, but we are still alive. Went to a committee, they offered me a chair. Asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting. The speaker got up and said, If we let them in, they will steal our daily bread. He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying they must die. Oh, we were in his mind, my dear. Oh, we were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. But they weren't German Jews. Went down the harbor and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear. Only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood, saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamed I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro, looking for you and me, my dear, looking for you and me. Excerpts from Anne Frank's diary. Friday, June 12, 1942, Amsterdam. Anne Frank, a Dutch Jew, woke up on her 13th birthday to find a diary among her gifts. I don't want to set down a series of bald facts in a diary like most people do, but I want this diary itself to be my friend, and I shall call my friend Kitty. The first half of 1943, my fits of crying, the loneliness, how I slowly began to see all my faults and shortcomings, which are so great and which seemed much greater then. During the day, I deliberately talked about anything and everything that was farthest from my thoughts, tried to draw Pim to me, but couldn't. Alone I had to face the difficult task of changing myself, to stop the everlasting reproaches, which were so oppressive and which reduced me to such terrible despondency. Margot and I were sent out of the room. Van Daan wanted to talk to Mummy alone. When we were alone together in our bedroom, Margot told me that the call-up was not for Daddy, but for her. I was more frightened than ever and began to cry. Margot is 16. Would they really take girls of that age away alone? But thank goodness she won't go. Mummy said so herself. That must be what Daddy meant when he talked about us going hiding. And whoever is happy will make others happy too. He who has courage and faith will never perish in misery. Her handwriting translated. This is a photo as I would wish myself to look all the time. Then I might have a chance to go to Hollywood. Anne Frank, 10th October 1942.